This is not a lecture about jealousy. It is not even a lecture about relationships. What you are about to hear is something far more fundamental. A map of how human consciousness itself can be quietly destabilized, reshaped, and ultimately controlled. Because the real danger is not when someone lies to you. The real danger begins when you start asking yourself, what if I'm the one who's wrong? Have you ever found yourself thinking, am I being too sensitive? Am I misinterpreting this? Maybe if I were more understanding, this wouldn't be a problem. If these questions begin to repeat, something deeper is already happening. Your perception is no longer operating from a stable center. Your internal compass, your ability to interpret reality, is beginning to drift. And that is precisely where psychological control begins. Let us establish something clearly. What is often labeled as jealousy in relationships is not merely an emotional reaction. It is a structural phenomenon. It is not about love. It is about control disguised as love. It is not about conflict. It is about destabilizing the very criteria by which you interpret reality. Most people, when faced with conflict, focus on events. Who said what? What exactly happened? But in psychologically manipulative relationships, the event itself is rarely the true battleground. The real target is something far more fundamental: your authority to interpret reality. In Western psychology, we might describe this as a breakdown of epistemic trust, the trust we place in our own perception, memory, and judgment. But interestingly, similar ideas appear in ancient Eastern philosophy. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a concept known as the bardo, often misunderstood as merely a state after death. But philosophically, bardo refers to something much more immediate, a state in which consciousness can no longer trust its own perceptions and instead becomes dependent on external projections. Reality itself has not collapsed, but the subject who interprets reality has begun to fracture. And this is exactly the psychological condition that emerges in manipulative relationships. Let us examine how this unfolds. Stage 1. The erosion of reality's criteria. The manipulator does not attack the event directly. Instead, they attack the standard by which the event is judged. You might hear statements like, maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal to you. Don't you think your standards are a bit too loose? Most people wouldn't see it that way. Notice what is happening. The question shifts. It is no longer what actually happened. It becomes, am I capable of judging what happened correctly? This is the first fracture. Over time, a subtle transformation occurs. You begin to monitor not reality, but yourself. Instead of asking, is this situation reasonable? You begin asking, am I reasonable? This is not self-reflection. This is the displacement of judgment. Your perception is no longer the starting point. It becomes something that must be verified, corrected, and approved externally. In the language of the bardo, this is the threshold. The moment when consciousness begins to doubt its own sensory authority and clings instead to external interpretations. Reality still exists, but your access to it is no longer direct. Stage 2. When explanation becomes guilt. At this point, something even more insidious occurs. Communication itself becomes dangerous. You attempt to explain, I was late because of work. Let me clarify what actually happened. But the response is not engagement, it is suspicion. Why are you talking so much? That sounds like an excuse. If you were innocent, you wouldn't need to explain. Explanation, which should function as a bridge to truth, is redefined as evidence of deception. This creates a paradox. If you speak, you are guilty. If you remain silent, you are also guilty. You are now trapped in what psychology calls a double bind. There is no correct move. Over time, the consequences are predictable. You begin to self-edit. Before speaking, you calculate. Is this too much? Will this make me look suspicious? Language itself is no longer a tool for truth. It becomes a risk management strategy, and eventually silence feels safer than expression. In philosophical terms, this is profound, because when a person loses the ability to speak freely, they do not just lose communication. They lose a part of their existence. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes a stage in which consciousness, overwhelmed by fear, begins to perceive its own expressions as threats. Speech becomes dangerous. Silence becomes survival. But that silence is not peace. It is the beginning of disappearance. Stage 3, the reconstruction of memory and emotion. Now we reach the most advanced phase. At this stage, the manipulator no longer argues with facts. They rewrite your experience. You might say, "That situation made me uncomfortable." And the response comes, "But you looked happy." You try to clarify. "I smiled, but I didn't feel okay." And they insist, "No, that's not how it seemed." At this point, the issue is no longer what happened. The issue is, who has the authority to define your inner experience? Gradually, your own memory becomes unstable. You begin to question, did I really feel that way? Am I misremembering? And once memory is destabilized, identity follows. Because identity is nothing more than the story we tell ourselves about our experiences. Then comes the final move. You're always like this. This is not criticism of behavior. It is a redefinition of identity. And when you resist, even your resistance becomes proof. See, you're doing it again. At this point, the external voice becomes internalized. The manipulation no longer requires the other person. It continues within you. In the final stage of the bardo, consciousness mistakes illusion for reality, and external projections become internal truth. The self dissolves not through force, but through gradual reinterpretation. Let me be precise. The first thing that collapses in these relationships is not your self-esteem. It is your sovereignty of judgment. Your right to say, what I see is real. What I feel matters. What I remember is valid. And therefore, the path out is not persuasion. It is not about winning arguments. It is not about explaining better. The first step is far simpler and far more difficult. Reclaiming the authority of your own perception. If there is even one sentence in this talk that makes you pause and think, maybe I wasn't losing my mind, then this lecture has already served its purpose. Because the moment you stop asking, am I the problem? And start asking, what is happening to my perception? That is the moment you begin to return. And from there, we can finally begin. And so we begin not by fixing the relationship, but by restoring something far more fundamental, your authority to perceive reality. Because once that authority is reclaimed, everything else, truth, judgment, even trust, must be redefined from the ground up. When trust becomes an endless trial, let us now move deeper. There is a moment in these relationships that often goes unnoticed, a subtle shift that changes everything. Imagine this. One partner begins questioning the other about past relationships. The questions grow increasingly detailed, increasingly intrusive, and when discomfort appears, when the person being questioned hesitates or withdraws, the response comes immediately. The fact that you're uncomfortable, that's the problem. At that moment, something profound has occurred. Trust is no longer about the present relationship. It becomes an endless process of self-justification. You are no longer living with someone. You are standing trial continuously. In philosophical terms, this resembles a state, described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a condition in which emotional reactions are mistaken for objective reality. The internal equation becomes dangerously simple. I feel anxious, therefore, something must be wrong with you. This is not reasoning. This is emotional identification. And once this identification takes hold, your discomfort is no longer seen as a human response. It is reinterpreted as evidence of guilt. At this stage, trust undergoes a complete transformation. It is no longer the quiet confidence that allows two people to exist freely. It becomes forced transparency, a demand that you expose yourself endlessly in order to soothe someone else's fear. I want to trust you, but you don't give me a chance. Now we arrive at a more advanced distortion. You may hear something that sounds almost reasonable. I want to trust you, but you're not giving me a chance. At first glance, this appears vulnerable, even sincere. But structurally, it is deeply manipulative. Because in this framework, trust is no longer a choice. It becomes a reward that you must earn. And more importantly, the responsibility for mistrust is transferred from the one who doubts to the one who is doubted. Consider how this unfolds. Suspicion is repeated again and again, and yet the conclusion is never reached. Instead, you hear, if you reassure me enough, then I'll trust you. But no matter how much you explain, it is never enough. There is always something missing, always another condition, always another test. At some point, you may even hear, fine, I'll let this go, just this once. Notice the implication. Trust is no longer mutual. It is granted like a favor, like an act of mercy. And in that moment, the relationship ceases to be equal. It becomes hierarchical. Trust is no longer a foundation. It becomes a tool of power. Philosophically, this reflects a deeper truth. The one who demands proof of trust is often not confronting a lack of evidence, but a lack of internal capacity. The fear is not, you are untrustworthy. The fear is, I do not know how to trust. But instead of facing that fear, it is projected outward. You are not doing enough. And so trust becomes an illusion, maintained not by inner stability, but by external control. What trust has become. In this distorted structure, trust is no longer what we think it is. It is no longer a space of freedom, a mutual choice, a foundation of connection. Instead, it becomes surveillance instead of freedom, obligation instead of choice, control instead of connection. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this entire structure emerges from a consciousness trapped in fear, a fear of abandonment so profound that it cannot awaken from its own projections. In order to hold on to the relationship, it creates a language of attachment, a language that does not connect, but binds. And that is why, in such relationships, no amount of explanation is ever enough. No amount of proof is ever sufficient. Because the issue was never the evidence. The issue was the structure itself, the turning point, reclaiming trust. So the question becomes, how does one recover trust in a system where trust has been weaponized? The answer is counterintuitive. You do not begin by trusting the other person again. You begin by reclaiming ownership of trust itself. Most people in these situations believe, if I can just trust again, the relationship will return to normal. But this belief is the final residue of manipulation, because it assumes that trust belongs to the relationship. It does not. Trust is not something granted by another person. It is a psychological capacity, a function of your own mind. The first step, then, is this, to shift your internal question. Not, will this make them suspicious? But, does this align with my own standard? This is the moment everything changes. Because trust is no longer an act of proving yourself to someone else. It becomes an act of remaining faithful to your own perception. In the language of the Bardo, this is the first step toward liberation. Not escaping the external world, but reclaiming the center of consciousness itself. Living without managing suspicion. The second step is even more radical. You must stop living in order to prevent suspicion and begin living in order to respect yourself. This produces very concrete behavioral changes. You do not explain what you do not wish to explain. You do not immediately respond to unreasonable demands. You replace justification with a simple statement. That is my choice. At this point, something extraordinary happens. You become a person who no longer manages another's anxiety. And from within the logic of control, this appears threatening. But philosophically, it is liberation. Because in a world governed by attachment, non-reaction is mistaken for rejection. Yet the ancient insight is clear. What you do not react to no longer has power over you. Trust as boundary, not outcome. Finally, trust must be redefined once more, not as a result, but as a boundary. Healthy trust does not mean we prove everything to each other. It means we do not violate each other's limits. In distorted relationships, boundaries disappear, and in their place, unlimited access is demanded in the name of trust. Recovery requires rejecting that premise entirely. You do not. Treat surveillance as trust. Treat explanation as obligation. Treat intrusion as intimacy. Instead, you return to a simpler position. You do not prove trust. You practice it internally. And in doing so, you no longer become someone who is trusted. You become someone who trusts oneself. The moment they fear most. Now we arrive at the most critical insight. There is something that the controlling partner fears more than betrayal, more than deception, more than loss. They fear the moment when you no longer need to prove anything. When you say, I will not explain this anymore. Believe me or not, that is your choice. Because in that moment, the object of control disappears. The justification for suspicion collapses. And for the first time, they are left alone with their own fear. In the language of the bardo, this is the moment when illusion loses its anchor, when projection finds nothing to attach to, and what follows is predictable. Anger, pleading, victimhood, not because you have done something wrong, but because the structure has begun to collapse. The final threshold. Paradoxically, unconditional trust is not comforting to such a system. It is destabilizing because the relationship was never built on trust. It was built on doubt. So when you say, I will not monitor you, I will not suspect you, and I will accept the consequences of that choice, this does not create peace. It creates collapse because now the relationship must reveal its true nature. And at that moment, something undeniable happens. The relationship will either begin to heal or it will reveal without disguise why it cannot continue. And when that moment arrives, you will stand before a choice, not between right and wrong, but between two fundamentally different directions, to preserve the relationship or to preserve yourself. And this is where clarity is essential, because these relationships do not end easily. They are not sustained by love alone, but by structure. Often, just as things begin to break, a temporary calm appears. The suspicion softens. The tone becomes gentle. Words like, maybe I was wrong, begin to emerge. And once again, doubt returns. But this time, within you. Have they changed? Was I too harsh? Should I wait a little longer? But philosophically, we must be precise. Change is not emotional expression. Change is structural transformation, not what is said, but where responsibility resides. The Tibetan Book of the Dead reminds us, before attachment disappears, it often changes form, from harsh to gentle, from control to connection, but the structure remains. And that is where we will go next. In the next lecture, We will examine the illusion of temporary normalcy, how control reorganizes itself, how to distinguish peace from strategy, and how to leave, if necessary, without guilt. This is not a message about abandoning someone, nor is it about saving someone. It is about answering one question honestly. Am I losing myself? Remember this. Guilt does not come from leaving someone behind. It comes from believing that you were responsible for carrying their fear. Their fear is theirs. Their attachment is theirs. Their journey is theirs. You cannot cross it for them. And so when a relationship ends, it is not punishment. It is the moment when truth can no longer be concealed. In the next part, we will explore how that truth disguises itself once again and how to see through it. If this lecture helped you reclaim even a small part of your perception, consider sharing it. Because this is not about winning against someone else. It is about not losing yourself. I'll see you in the next lecture.